I'm Dr. Sophie Messager, and this is the Wisdom Messenger podcast. In this show, I interview pioneers in women's health and personal development about groundbreaking concepts that help women reclaim lost knowledge and restore inner wisdom. By bridging insights from ancient traditions and modern research, we question stale cultural narratives and midwife a new paradigm around birth, life transitions, and women's autonomy. Join me as we delve into stories and studies that empower women to reconnect with their inner voice and live their truth. Tune in as we rediscover what it means to fully trust ourselves and shape our collective future. In this episode, I interviewed Jeff Strong, a drummer and researcher exploring drumming's neurological benefits. We discuss his ADHD journey, his research on drumming therapeutic effects for various conditions, including neurodivergence and anxiety, and the historical significance of rhythmic practices. Our conversation covers brainwave entrainment, shamanic techniques, and how drumming intersects with mental health and education. Listen in to gain deep insights into alternative healing approaches and the power of rhythm in our lives. So welcome to this episode of the Wisdom Messenger, and today I'm very excited to be interviewing Jeff Strong. Jeff is a percussionist, is a drum healer, a drummer, someone who's been also a research scientist in the field of drumming, somebody who is also an adult with ADHD and has been publishing dozens of books and articles about what drumming does to the brain, with a specific focus around what it does to the brain of people who are neurodivergent. And to get us started, Jeff, I'd really like you to explain how did you your life journey into that. And I know it's quite a long life journey, so if you can give us like a potted history of your journey through this work that you're doing now.
Sure thing. Let's see. I started playing drums very, very young. I have actually photos of me playing at 4. By the time I was 14, I was playing professionally and studying. At 18, I went on the road full time. By the time I was 16, I was working full time. But 18, I toured with different groups, and did a year of 50 weeks on tour at that age. And I thought, geez, I got to go back to school. So I went to the Musicians Institute in Los Angeles. This was in the early 80s. And while I was there, studying percussion is, you're generally just playing drums. But when you're that level of music school, you have to also learn music theory. And in the midst of that, I discovered that I really struggled with the academics of that stuff that wasn't playing, not playing the drums. And so I was ultimately diagnosed with ADHD at that point. And, it had been pretty well hidden, except if you look at the fact that I was always tapping on stuff, which fidgeting to focus is a thing for ADHD. So being a drummer was perfect. It was really easy until I was forced to hit my level of being able to kind of BS my way through things. So in the midst of that, I decided I would start experimenting with ways of being able to focus on the stuff I didn't really want to do, which was music theory. And I came up with a plan to reward myself after my music theory work to do my favorite stuff, which was sight reading. Now, sight reading involves taking a piece of music you've never seen before and being able to interpret it and play it properly with the right feel, the right inflections, everything that you would need to do. And I wanted to be a studio drummer, so that was my thing. And I asked my teacher one day, I said, so, we're doing these exercises and what tempo would I need to play at in order to get really competent, to be able to perform at a level that if I went into the studio and somebody gave me a chart, I'd be able to read it and do it flawlessly. He said, well, and he was spitballing. He said, well, if you could play a march tempo, 16th notes of march tempo, you'd be good. And then, so I did the math, and 120 beats per minute playing quarter notes, the metronome quarter notes, playing 16th notes, which puts me at essentially 8 beats per second was the math I figured I needed to do. And I had this little metronome at the time called a Dr. Beat, and it clicked off the metronome, but then you could bring in the subdivisions. So I could set a quarter note 120 beats per minute, and then I could set it to play 16th notes so that I was able to click along at the right tempo. And so I practiced and practiced and practiced. And after a while, I realized that my theory of doing music theory first and then the sight reading second really didn't fit my personality. So I decided to do the sight reading first and then do the music theory. And I discovered that my ability to focus increased. My grades went up on music therapy. I was grasping concepts I couldn't get before. The circle of fifths and stuff that just as a percussionist just didn't make sense to me. I ended up minoring in keyboards, synthesizers. I was programming synthesizers and playing synths, which plays into what I do today with my music as well. But that was really the beginning of it for me. And this was 1983. And it stuck in the back of my mind after I graduated and went on a regular music career. I was teaching and touring and doing the things that you do as a drummer, playing drum set. But all the while, this stuck in the back of my head, and I'm thinking, there's something about this concept of being able to focus by having these what really were variable rhythms. They were unpredictable patterns, and that creates novelty. And our ADHD brains especially really crave novelty. That's how we function. You give somebody with ADHD something they're interested in, they can just go all out on it. But you give them something mundane and forget it, the brain shuts down, and it's a physiological thing, right? It's so throughout my 20s, I was really thinking about it. As I was playing, and after a while, touring with different groups and being what was considered a sideman, was hard. I was producing people. I was working in a recording studio and doing everything I could, and I felt like I wasn't gaining anywhere, and decided, you know what? I really want to focus on this concept of what happens in the brain. So I dropped all of that, quit everything, stopped touring. I kept teaching, but I shifted my teaching a little bit. Started bringing in hand drums as well as drum set, because I realized that in order to do what I wanted to do with the research, it couldn't be drum set because of the instrumentation that's involved. It needed to really be an instrument that I could, just a single instrument in order to test it. And so I really started focusing on the hand drums. And in 1992, I started my clinical research, really looking at what happens to someone not playing the drum, but listening, because I realized not everybody would want to play. And truly, by the time I started doing this, I found that there's very few students I had who could play at 8 beats per second for any length of time. It's fast. And to be able to do that improvisationally with constantly changing rhythms is, even today, after all the people I've taught, it's single percentages of people who can develop the technique to play that way. So I was focusing on what happens when you listened.
Yeah.
And as well, it turns out that one of my early students was also a psychologist who was not only interested in the shamanic stuff, which we'll get to, but also was a psychologist in the local school system. He was the autism specialist in the school district in St. Paul, Minnesota. And we got to talking, and at that point I had been playing with kids with autism and really seeing some really good things. And he got me basically involved to be able to get a study in the school district. And so we brought a study in. We did an 8-week study looking at how fast complex drumming could calm a brain. And we looked at it from, an episodic level. In other words, we rated anxiety before and after a listening session. We also looked at long-term change over 8 weeks and saw some really significant changes. And because of that, because of the people who were running that program in that particular school, I was asked then to speak at the state of Minnesota Autism Society's conference to present research. And then word started spreading, and before I knew it, and then over the next 5 years, I spoke at over 100 professional research conferences on autism, talking about what we were doing and the changes we were seeing. And we were developing basically as much clinical data as we could, and we've been collecting it since. It's been over 30 years. So, not only do we look at it behaviorally, which is where we started, and even today, ADHD and autism are diagnosed behaviorally. It's not a brain scan you can do that'll tell you you have it. Yeah. So, most of our research was behavioral. And then about 2015, we started doing EEG research. And that's where we're at now. We're still collecting a lot of clinical research because we still see thousands of clients every year with our online systems, and we track all that data. But so it's been 30 years plus of really looking at how musical rhythm impacts brain function, not only from a behavioral standpoint, and not just autism and ADHD and sleep disorders, anxiety disorders, but really what it means towards consciousness, which is what I'm really fascinated about now as I get older and start thinking about life expectancy, what happens when we die. I was really always fascinated in the shamanic end of things, what happens in altered state of consciousnesses, because all the autism stuff that we do is, like I said, 8 beats per second. This is an awake state that we work on. But the traditional technique that we draw this from, that was my first inspiration to this idea of what's called brainwave entrainment, which is the idea that the brain waves, the rhythms in your brain is, functions by rhythmic pulsations. Yeah. And those brain waves can be influenced by an auditory signal. And so if I'm playing, for instance, the drum at 8 beats per second, I can get the brain to actually oscillate at 8 beats per second, which is where it's really beneficial for ADHD and autism. But the techniques that I had the idea from, tens of thousands of years old, were using 4 beats per second, half this tempo, to bring the brain down into a low, internally directed state called theta. And theta is a meditative state. It's also the state where we can have otherworldly experiences. This is the state that traditional shamanic practitioners will go into. Yeah. And I always thought that was fascinating for a lot of reasons. One of which, not to get too far off tangent here, but people with ADHD, when we don't focus, when we're not giving novelty, our brains tend to idle in a theta state. So, and this is one of the theories that I had early on, and I'm not alone in this, in that one of the reasons that people with ADHD who are not medicated, whose brains are allowed to get into that idle state, can be so creative, is because they're in this altered state of consciousness. We're flighty, we're off in our own world, right? That's theta, and there's real power there. And I thought this is an interesting world to explore, because most of my work and ideas are really out there. And it's because I'm not afraid to go into a place of thinking outside the box. And that's one of the strengths of people with ADHD. Yeah. And so that's an area that we've focused really heavily on with the EEG research, because to me, that's the most fun. It's the most fun to see what's happening. So so that's the short of it. I'd
like to interrupt you very briefly, Jeff, and could you explain to people listening to this podcast, because you're the first person that I've heard that talks about it from a higher point of view. Usually most of the drumming, as you say, shamanic drumming, 4 beats per second, it just gets people in this theta state. But you're the first person I've come across who talks about doubling that rhythm. Explain to us how it calms down the brain of people when it's so much faster.
Yeah, I know. That is the best question, because it's counterintuitive. When you think about music, when you think about calming music, you think about soothing tones, not a lot of activity, just keeping it really simple so that the brain can just settle into it. And that works. It's called association, and it's a psychological calm. It's a soothing that happens. We find these tones and this pace really soothing and comforting, and therefore we'll settle in. So what happens is because of the soothing aspect, it hits us, the brain waves hit second. So either way, if I'm getting into a calm state, I should back up just a half second.
Yeah.
Our brains during normal activity tend to oscillate randomly based upon external stimulus in a beta activity.
Yeah.
Just to break down the brainwave states, there are 5 brainwave states. The lowest is delta, and it exists around 1/2 pulsation to around 4 pulsations per second, called hertz, each cycle per second. Then there's theta, which is about 4 to 8. Both delta and theta are internally directed states. They're not something where you're reacting to the world around you. You are responding to internal stimuli or no stimuli. But in the theta, we're asleep, and low theta and delta, basically. Then the third state is alpha, exists between around 8 and 12 cycles per second, or hertz, rhythms per second. And that's what's called the relaxed alert state. So we're externally directed, but our brains are settled in, we're relaxed. And then there's beta, which is roughly 13 to 30 hertz. This is chaotic, random activity responding to stimuli. So what we take in with our senses, our brain will spike with beta activity, depending on what it is. So we're hearing somebody talk, the language center of our brain starts becoming active around this beta level. And then the 30 to around 100 hertz is a state called gamma. That's considered higher levels of cognition. It's also, interestingly enough, a state that often is excited or activated when we go into a low theta. So when somebody goes into a true shamanic state or a really deeply altered state, you're also seeing gamma activity. When you're in another state, we see it with alpha, that you can get gamma activity once you get somebody settled in. So that's a really powerful thing we're looking at a lot right now. We're not understanding it too much, but I'll talk a little bit more about that later when I talk about another concept that's going on with shamanic stuff. So when someone listens to a drumming rhythm at 8 beats per second, even though it's really quick, it actually brings the brain into this relaxed alert state, which is a really calm place to be. If our brains are synchronized at alpha, we are really calm, and we're not in reaction to stimulus like we are in beta. So just think of our brains as being there's 2 levels that happen with stimulation with us. The first is a reaction to. The second is a response based upon association. So the first thing we do is we hear, say for instance, a sound, and our brain's going to activate and say, what is this? Fight or flight. So our hippocampus is going to go, our reticular activating system is going to go, and we're going to respond to see if it's something we need to worry about. And almost immediately thereafter, we're going to notice if this is something we've had experience with before. We're going to associate it with something in the past. So barring any trauma, if it's just a normal sound, we're going to associate that with something in our past, and we're going to be able to then respond. And hopefully, we'll settle in, and that spike of beta activity may settle down to alpha.
Yeah.
And then we're gonna respond that way. If the association is of a traumatic event in our past, trauma, we're going to respond in a very different way. So that sound or that experience may be different for you or me, depending on what our history is. And that also plays into the idea here that when someone chooses regular music to calm to, you're going to hear different people say different things. One of the classic examples is a person with ADHD is going to say, well, that classical music doesn't calm me. I listen to heavy metal. That calms me down. because the association with that kind of catharsis for a lot of people, that kind of energy and that kind of drive helps settle the chaotic mind of an ADHD individual. It actually will bring that idle theta, which we get lost in, out of theta. And that's important. And that's why when I recommend people who listen to regular music to calm, it's all about what works for you. You know, do you need Native American flute music? Do you need some nice classical stuff, or do you need heavy metal? It's all up to you and what you associate with. And so calming with 8 beats per second drumming is a physiological response. There is no association. Yes, a lot of people will describe when they hear this, it sounds very tribal. It sounds like a, jungle stuff or whatever association they have with hand drums, which, that's single hand drums have their own thing. We get around that by having people play it very quietly. And so what ends up happening is the brain now is seeking out, which is a really powerful piece. It's seeking out the stimulus, and therefore it activates the brain in a slightly different way. And we're more apt at that point to entrain, to synchronize with that rhythm. So that's the basics of it.
Yeah. So I'm just curious, to hear, what's some of the most surprising or maybe striking stories you've experienced in this work using drumming to entrain people's brain, and any stories you'd like to share with us that really stick in your mind as surprising or powerful?
That's a really good question. Well, there's a couple layers to that. One is, the clinical work. I remember going into our first, when I first started doing the research, I started off playing in people's living rooms.
Yeah.
Or I would go into residential facilities that house people with autism, or I'd go into hospitals and play for people who were in crisis. And one of the first ones I went into, I got called to play at a place called, I shouldn't mention the name of it. It was a residential facility in northern Arizona that was really having some struggles. They were at risk of losing their license to be able to run their facility because there was so many violent outbursts among the residents. One guy in particular would just go off for no reason at all. And I remember coming in and the director of the facility said, she took me to the dining room in this facility and said, this is where we have most of our problems because of eating. And there's a lot of outbursts that happen here. And, this is where we end up having to call in, help to tone it down. And I said, why don't I just go into the corner and I'm just going to watch. And if something happens, I'm going to play. Yeah. I'll just watch dinner and just see what happens. And sure enough, not 5 minutes into it, one guy starts going after another guy's food. And I start tapping my drum really quietly. I'm just tapping. I'm playing, 8 beats per second. I'm playing fast, Yeah. I don't know if you can hear that, but and I'm just playing really quietly, and I'm watching this behavior, and it didn't take 30 seconds, even at a quiet volume for me to play, for them to stop what they were doing. The guy who was going after the other guy's food and the other guy who was reacting crazy, they both just stopped and just were looking around, trying to understand what was happening. This rhythm at a low enough volume was enough to key into their unconscious, subconscious part of their mind and shifted their awareness almost immediately. And that was the first time I'd seen it happen that dramatically. I mean, I'd played for people one-on-one, but to see it in a group and settle a room that quickly was really something. And then, then I had a bunch of experiences early on with, my teachers. And, I played when I first started out, when I was learning these hand drumming rhythms, I first started by working with a practitioner who was involved in a technique called Shango. And Shango is a religion based upon Orisha worship from West Africa. And this particular technique developed on the island of Trinidad, where there was a unique confluence of two styles of this Orisha worship that happened for centuries. And I remember playing at the church that he belonged to, which did practice Shango, and just watching the reaction of people, but also at one point feeling the drumming take me over in a way that I had never experienced before. And I felt like I had an out-of-body experience.
Mm.
And I was really intrigued by that. This happened in the early 80s, back when I was first, discovering the concept of how to focus. And that stuck in the back of my mind. And then when I started really looking at this, I happened upon a shamanic teacher and was exploring the shamanism really heavily, really looking at the altered state of consciousness. And then I had a bunch of other what I would consider out-of-body experiences. And that always, because that's kind of what I'm focusing on now. What creates this dissociation to that level?
Mm.
What does it mean? Because there's something there, and it also goes to this concept that we are not just in this body with this brain that responds in a very, predictable way. There's something more going on. So I probably have dozens and dozens of the shamanic experiences and the out of body and the altered states and that stuff. Those are the fun ones for me. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, shoot. I can't hear you. Try again.
Huh.
Oh, now you're back.
Okay. So
Okay.
to follow on to what you just said, I'd be really interested to hear more about, something quite controversial that I know you talk about in one of your courses, which is the parallel and the differences between the state of consciousness alteration caused by drumming versus the state of consciousness alteration produced by psychedelics. I'd like you to tell us a bit more about that, because I don't think people realize how powerful the drum is, and I think that's a very good analogy to use.
Yeah. I've been fascinated by this for 20 years. I smoked a lot of marijuana when I was a kid and did a lot of mushrooms. And, I had a lot of experiences before I even started doing the shamanic stuff. I can say that because marijuana is not legal in New Mexico, but a fascinating thing to me. Now, the brain seems to go in the same space. Now, I will say that one of the things that's so seductive about the psychedelics is that they are very potent, and they're very, the experiences tend to be much more dramatic for a lot of people than can happen with drumming. The drumming is more subtle, which I think for people who are just going for a quick high is not as, it's not as interesting. If I just want a quick high, or I don't even know what else. I mean, if somebody wants to use an altered state to kind of increase their connection or self-awareness, you'd think you'd want to do it in a pace that's a little bit better.
Yeah.
But from a physiological perspective, the research that's going on with psychedelics and the drumming are not really parallel at this point. The psychedelics, they're looking at primarily, what I'm hearing is that they're looking at the default mode network as a theory. And the default mode network is a concept where, and I talked about this a little bit with the ADHD, when we go idle, when we are just in a default state as it is, our brains go into a rest state. And the theory is that this is kind of our default. So therefore the default mode network, is it's centered in the deeper centers of the brain. So you can't see this through EEG. And given that we've been doing research on EEG, we're having to make some guesses as to what's happening. But when I look at what we're doing here, and I look at the fact that the drumming can pull someone out of a default setting.
Yeah.
And actually, if I'm playing 4 beats per second, and my default setting is theta, 4 beats per second, am I really pulling it out? No, I'm more synchronizing it. I'm more catalyzing a greater state of that. But the theory with the psychedelics is that you've got this default mode network, which could be a really powerful place to go into an altered state.
Yeah.
And which I can see that. And if I look at this idea that and they don't know what the mechanism this is that makes this happen. So if we look at that and we look at what's happening with what we've seen with the drumming, especially how it compares to trying to do a meditation without the drumming, which I think is a really important piece to look at, because if you look at the 3 levels of this, or the 3 kind of ways of viewing it, you have the psychedelic, which is going to create a chemical intervention, which is going to change the brain.
Yeah.
You've got somebody who's trying to meditate and trying to get into an altered state, which is for most of us, especially that level of theta, is nearly impossible. Really, you see some research showing some really adept 20, 30, 40-year Buddhists who meditate and chant every day finally get there.
Yeah.
It's not a realistic thing to expect that the average person is going to be able to accomplish that on their own.
Yeah.
And if you look at what we've done with the EEG, and I can share with you at some point some videos I've done on this, where I show over time what happens when somebody listens or doesn't listen to drumming. And then you take the drumming, you can definitely see how this altered state happens.
Yeah.
So there's no question, looking at the EEG research we've done, that somebody gets into this altered state. And actually, this is where I think the thing that the disconnect that a lot of people have when they start thinking about the psychedelics versus the drumming is, aside from the fact that very few people are looking at it, because the guys who are interested in psychedelics, they're only interested in psychedelics, and the drummers are interested in drumming. And but the psychedelics research is now looking at this gamma level of consciousness as well. And they're starting to see, so they're starting to pull in some EEG. They're starting to see some gamma activity. And they're saying, oh, there's something really cool happening here. And there's theta, there's gamma, which is 30 to 100 hertz. Impossible to do with drumming. You can't play 30 hertz with the drum.
Of course not, yeah.
Because it's a tone now. It's something you can actually hear is a very deep tone. So that was the argument for psychedelic people to say, well, see, the drumming can't do that because the drumming can't induce gamma. I have a video on YouTube that shows drumming induces gamma, especially and including going to theta. I have some videos that show gamma and alpha as well. And so if trick to psychedelics do, and some of what they do is not only to activate the default mode network, which is deep in the brain, which is a nidal state, and induce gamma. And then we look at the EEG research we're doing, where we can see that we can activate the low theta through entrainment, which should then carry down to the default mode network, if that's a default state, which it should be. And we're actually seeing gamma happening on top of it. It seems there's a parallel there. And then if you actually talk to people who've had these experiences, somebody who's actually gotten into the shamanic state of consciousness fully, and this is not something. This is something we develop. This is a skill we develop. They used to talk about in the shamanic cultures that you have to have a shamanic death in order to be considered a shaman. You have to have some otherworldly experience or some way of basically have had an altered world.
Yeah.
Not everybody in the tribe can become a shaman because not everybody's brain can go there.
Yeah.
In traditional shamanic cultures, the shamans enter the altered state with the drumming. The person they're working on or healing or whatever doesn't, because this is a learned experience. We've seen that if we play the drum, and when people start my course, my Beyond Shamanism course, I get so many emails, I'm not feeling anything yet. Well, no, you don't, because your brain takes time to learn to do this. Entrainment is a learned response. And the beauty of it is, and this, I'm not the only one who's seen this research, research done, it's 30 years ago by, oh, geez, I forgot her name. It'll come to me as I'm going. Showing that the first few times one listens to a shamanic beat, entrainment doesn't happen.
Yeah.
That it takes multiple times. And the more you do it, the quicker you get in. And really gifted, experienced shamanic practitioners can simply hear the brain and the drum in their brain and get in, which explains why, this is going to go sideways some more because that's what I do, explains why as the Crusades went on and the Christianity was trying to knock out all of the traditional shamanic practices in Europe, the drum disappeared, but the practices did not. And here in New Mexico, where I live, there's a long tradition for the last 400 years of people coming over from Spain primarily, curanderos who came over who traditionally practiced shamanism, who dropped the drum from their practices because that was the indicator to the Christians that they were doing some pagan practices. So they had to get rid of the instrument, but they kept the practice and they kept the meditations. But what ended up happening is you had fewer curanderos who could really do that level of work, and they had to find a way to get into altered states.
Yeah.
Primarily, which explains a little bit of some of what happens here in this region with using mushrooms, psilocybin, and what we have around here, datura, which, if you use it properly, can create an altered state. It's a hallucinogen, but that wasn't traditional. That came after the fact because they couldn't use the drum.
Yeah.
So
you say in your course Beyond Shamanism that your personal belief around that is that the culture, not normal for human, is percussion as a tool for changing consciousness, and that only 10% of the cultures around the world who did not develop percussion use for some reason then started using psychedelics instead. Do you want to expand a bit on that?
Yeah, I think there's two levels to that. One is there are certain cultures that just like in Peru, the practitioners of ayahuasca that use ayahuasca, and there's a few places around the world where different cultures discovered hallucinogen that really was powerful enough and easy enough to acquire and use, that the drum didn't become a central point.
Yeah.
I think that the drum is often still used ancillarily with it.
Yeah.
And so you have a few, and I haven't been able to identify how many there really are. I don't think it's 10%, to be honest with you.
You think it's less?
I think it is fewer than that around the world, and I think it's centered in just a couple areas. But I do think, again, coming back to America, and how the native tribes here were treated with their religion. I think the use of peyote mushrooms and other mind-altering substances came later than the drum. I think it was almost a response to the fact that they can't really use the drum. I don't think that they were not used at all, but I think the drum and the chemicals were used. And then when the drum was dropped, the chemicals became more important.
Yeah.
The drum is still used today, but not quite in the same way. You know, the shamanism is really, since I started doing help before that, Michael Harner put out a book on shamanism, I think in 1980.
Yeah.
So, you know, these last 45 years, 40 plus years, has really created an awareness to traditional shamanic techniques that didn't exist for many hundreds of years.
Yeah.
And really, until the 1900s, I think it was 1934, native tribes here were allowed to then practice their religion. But from the late 1800s, I think 1787, I believe, was when the U.S. government decided that the natives could not practice their traditional religions. And so, you know, the drum disappeared. And so if they were going to be able to do any kind of shamanic practice, they would have to find another way.
Yeah.
And, you know, people aren't going to stop doing these things. They're just going to find a way to hide it. It's true with anything.
Yeah.
So I think that, you know, when you really look at the history of shamanic practices, the drumming is integral.
Yeah.
And it's the key to the altered state. And I think that some people have chosen to include the chemicals, and then ultimately the drum fell off. For politics. And then there's some places, just I would say probably 5% or less of the places around the world did use a drum. And I should expand the drum to include any percussion, because some places used rattles and sticks, but they still played a pulse of 8 beats per second. And then you had some variations where you also had ecstatic dancing, which helps bring down as well, into the theta, you know, and those are generally combined with the drumming anyway.
And do you think that, sorry, I'm doing a bit of a side tangent here as well, but do you think that the reason why, you know, in the process of Western European invading the world, the idea of, maybe, I'm not sure if it was conscious, but the idea of removing that type of practice was an idea of control, because it's really hard to control people who enter altered state of consciousness, right? That's why all the sort of authoritarian regime always ban music, always ban dancing, always ban singing, and any form of stuff that can facilitate trance.
Yeah, absolutely. There's absolutely. And, you know, as you know, you tie it to someone's spiritual and religious practice, and if you want to control them, and then you add to the fact that Western European culture was pretty dominated by Christian ideas, and the need to convert everybody to Christianity.
Yeah.
You know, this Shango practice that I first learned was a synchronization of a blend of the African Orisha worship and Catholicism, and all of the variations on that you find here in the West, Voodoo, Santeria, Candomblé, Umbando, are all variations on this Western African spiritual practice and Catholicism, where the spirits from the West African traditions were hidden behind Catholic saints. And the most Catholic of these versions is Santeria, which is really the most popular in Cuba, and in certain parts of the southeastern U.S., mostly southern Florida and Louisiana. That's really Catholic centric. So you see a lot of like hoodoo shops, for instance, in Louisiana, New Orleans especially, where they have all these candles for the different saints. Well, those are the different spirits that are part of that original tradition. So you had the slave trade grabbing people from West Africa, bringing them into the United States and those islands, and trying to control them by getting rid of their religion. Don't let them drum. Don't let them do their traditional practices. So they hid it behind the Catholicism in different levels of amounts. And it was all dependent on how much Catholicism was put into this, was dependent on how brutal the slave owners were towards their captives. So the more uprisings there were, the more brutality there was, the more violence was towards slaves, the more you see things like Santeria. And the less violence you saw, the less control you see to try putting on these slaves, you had more of the African, which is the Shango.
Mm.
Um, but yeah, it's an unfortunate thing.
Yeah, it sure is. And I'm curious to hear, Jeff, what do you see as the most common? There's two questions I want to ask you. I can ask them both, and you can decide which one is relevant to answer first. You know, the one is like, what do you see as the most common misconception around drum healing? You know, the most common disbelief. Because what fascinates me is there's clearly a lot of research that goes back many, many years that is done using very modern tools, because you mentioned EEG, and yet most people tend to still dismiss any form of drumming as some kind of woo hippie. You know, there's still a very what word am I looking? I can't find a word, but what's a word to describe the movement of people in Europe and then invading native country, colonialism. Yeah, there's basically still a form of colonialist mindset around, despite their science. Do you see what I mean? The contrast of that really shocks me, and I'm just curious to hear, you know, what kind of common misconception people have, and B, how come more people know that drumming can do some amazing things to the brain?
Yeah, that's yeah, absolutely. I years ago, I got a call from Remo Belli. He's he was the creator and the president of Remo Drums. Remo Drums are they came out with the first hand drums, and they were trying to popularize hand drumming, and a lot of their focus was on drum circles, right? Because that's where it starts. I mean, if we take a look at the modern contemporary use of drumming therapeutically, we're going to look at the drum circle.
Yeah.
And we're going to start in the 1980s. We could probably go back to the 60s with kind of the hippie movement, but those were just more, you know, festival kind of, let's just jam, right?
Yeah.
But it wasn't until the 80s that this concept that playing together in community, an instrument, and drums are easy to just jump into, right? We can all sit in a circle, and we can sit with a drum, and we can play poorly or well, but we get to play together, and we can have a wellness experience. That started, and Ruma Belli got right on the forefront of that. And he called me at one point out of the blue in the mid 90s. He'd heard about what I was doing, and he was somewhat incredulous. He said, you know, I hear what you're doing. I love what you're doing. Tell me how you're using the drum circle for these kids. And I said, I'm not. And he couldn't understand it, because the only thing that he could understand, and this is a guy steeped in it. He's a drummer. He loves drums. He's selling drums. He's trying to build a movement of drumming for wellness. His wife's a physician. He understands all this stuff. And he's saying, how can you use drumming outside of a drum circle? And I said, well, it changes the brain. And it took a while for him to start getting the concept of it. And I will say this, he told me time and time again, do not use the word healing. So I created a drum course called Drum Healing.
Yeah.
But his comment was, they don't, society, our Western society can't comprehend that. And I completely agree with it, even after 30 more years of doing this, because when I try to present EEG research and show what auditory driving is, I still get a lot of, what are you talking about? What do you mean? How is this possible? And so I'm not sure we're through that yet.
I
I
think
think
there's a wind of change. You may not know, but there's a very famous French woman called Corinne Sombrin who trained as a shaman with Mongolian shamans, who's managed to start a trans science research institute in Paris after banging her head against the system for 10 years. And they published their first paper in 2017. And now
wow.
there's about 15 different research projects. Not lots of people who don't speak French. I'm French and I speak English and French, so it's very convenient to read research in both languages. The fact that she was able to publish in 2017, despite it wasn't ready before, I feel the wind of change. And as long as we bring technology, because one the joke I always like to make is if the sound you're making with your drum came out of some fancy machine with flashing lights and beeping sounds, people would say, "Ooh, science." But because the way it
Exactly.
looks,
Yes, yes,
people
exactly.
understand.
Exactly. That is the wall I've been banging my head on for 30 years.
Yeah.
We use everything we can to not say drumming, even though that's what we do. You know, we talk about musical rhythm, applied musical rhythm. We talk about auditory driving. We talk about all these things, and we use our technology with, and the reason I started doing the EEG videos was I wanted to show that that there is something going on here in the brain. And my first step into this was to really look at what's called binaural beats, because those were science, right? This is the machine it came out of. And just to kind of give an overview of what a binaural beat is. Basically, you know, our brains hear frequency, right?
Yeah.
And a binaural beat is when you hear one frequency in one ear and a slightly different frequency in another ear. And if you think about frequency as a wave pattern, it's a cycle, right?
Yeah.
It's a wave that goes up and down. And that wave is a certain length, a certain time space. So if you take the middle A, for instance, on a keyboard, 440 hertz, let's say it is. There's 440 of these little waveforms. You know, it starts at a 0 point, it goes up, down, and back to the 0. There's 440 of these every second, right? And that creates a tone that you can hear in your ear. And you take another one that's 444 hertz. So now there's 444 of these little shapes across the second. And if you superimpose them over that 1 second period, you're going to find there's 4 times over that second that their start and end points converge. And what happens is your brain hears that as a pulse. And that's called a beat frequency. So a binaural beat is the idea that you can have someone hear through headphones or speakers placed equidistant from each ear, these 2 different tones, and your brain is going to start hearing this pulsation. That can change the brain. And so starting in the 50s, people started looking at this. And the first guy to do this was Robert Monroe. He was a radio station owner who understood frequency, because, you know, he's sending out this signal. And he read about binaural beats, and he thought, wow, this is really cool. And he started playing around with it. And then 1972, 73, I think it was, he published he patented this concept of the frequency following response, that you can do this. At the same time, Gerald Oster in 73 wrote a scientific paper that got published about beat frequencies, showing that it can change and it can create the same frequency in the brain. So now not only did they show these beat frequencies created this pulsation in the brain, which I think they'd known about for 100 years, society had known about, but they proved it with their machines and EEG.
Yeah.
And so now you had this, okay, now we have brainwave entrainment. So here's a concept that has been proven. So the next step was to say, okay, well, that's a beat created out of a frequency, couple frequencies. A drum beat is a pure beat. It should do the same thing. And so that's where that piece came from. So when I first started doing my research and was laying out the foundations for what we were doing before I did any EEG research, because we couldn't afford the machinery here forever. It was expensive stuff. I would always point back to the beat frequencies, to the binaural beats, and say, this is what's going on. And so you've got three types of music, for lack of a better word, music or sound healing, right? You've got music therapy, which is your basic concept of music can create a psychological soothing response. And if you have somebody who's skilled at choosing music, they can go in and they can play music that's going to have this great response.
Yeah.
And then go to nursing homes, or they can go play with somebody and they're going to play their guitar and it's going to feel really good. And, you know, that's one area. And then you've got the binaural beat world, which has always been kind of fringe, but there's always been a market for it. And then you've got another line of research that happened in the 40s. A guy, an ear, nose, throat physician called Alfred Tomatis, you're probably familiar with him.
Yes.
Because he was French, developed this concept that you can only hear certain frequencies, that we all have deficits in the frequencies that we can hear. And sometimes those deficits can play into our behavior. And he developed a technique where he would he would modulate classical music by changing the frequencies and you know, eliminating some frequencies, enhancing other ones in order to balance out a person's audiogram. And an audiogram is simply the way we hear frequencies. It's a test that's done by audiologists to determine, oh, you can't hear 5 hertz or 5 kilohertz. No one can hear 5 hertz, but you can't hear 5 kilohertz. And Tomatis would say, hey, I can fix that. You know, he'll play some classical music with an enhanced 5 kilohertz, right? And he'll randomly pulsate that through to teach your brain to hear it, right? And he started working with people on the autism spectrum and started seeing some changes. And then he had a protege, Guy Bérard, who refined this technique and developed a slightly different way of approaching it with a different machine, different protocols. And that one caught on. He developed a thing called auditory integration training. And now you have these 3 basic concepts now of sound. You've got the music therapy, you've got the binaural beats, and now you've got the idea here that you can influence brain activity in some unknown way by modulating the frequencies somebody hears by listening to a certain style of music over time. And these were the 3 kind of pillars of music, sound therapy, healing. And then you had your gongs and, you know, gobbledygook like that, but that's all new age stuff, right? These are the 3 techniques that had some scientific foundation, even though if you really look at the idea of modulating frequencies, there really is the scientific foundation. Years ago, I spoke at a conference which was run by the guy who did the largest study on auditory integration training in the world. He was telling me all the theories that they had as to why it worked. And he said, pick one. We don't know, right? And these are the scientists that are supposed to know this stuff. So, I can tell you exactly what's going on. It's novelty. It's the same thing I discovered when I played my syncopation, my sight reading exercises. Playing random novel stimulus, listening to random novel stimulus activates and focuses the brain. It's fairly simple. And when you have somebody who can't respond to the world well, if you can get their brain to engage, now they can respond better. It's simple as that. The difference is that often these techniques are somewhat random. But that's a different line of research we've done. But so when I started looking at the drumming and was starting to look at the science of it, I drew from those 3, primarily the Tomatis approach of random novelty, and then the binaural beat approach of brainwave entrainment. And that's where we came up with our ideas.
My last question to you, Jeff, is how do you imagine the future of, you know, drum healing integrating with maybe modern medicinal practices? How do you visualize?
Oh, this is exciting to me. Two things. You know, I have two of my, I started teaching in 2015 because I wanted to go beyond what I could do with what I'm doing.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I know that what I'm doing is a niche. We have a Brain Stim audio. We have our custom programs. I'm as busy as I can be doing that stuff. I love it. I can reach as many people as the internet will let me. It's all well and good, but it's one guy's idea, right?
Yeah.
And you've got these techniques, these foundations of shamanic practices. You've got people doing drumming, starting with drum circles and wellness, and then everybody's got an idea, right? All these geniuses are out there, ready to do something, and I'm thinking, okay, I came out with my drum healing course saying, okay, we're going to take this concept of what you guys can do, because most of my first students were people who had trained in drum circles. They were drum circle practitioners. And I was saying, listen, if you learn some specific techniques that have some scientific foundation and some history to them, and draw from some of our clinical research, you can take your drum circles and go a whole bunch of different directions with them. So here's some basic techniques you can do, and we'll grow from there. And do your thing, don't do my thing, you know? And when I decided, when I had the concept of beyond shamanism, I said, okay, you've got this great technique where shamanic practitioners were going into this altered state, doing all these really cool shamanic techniques, right? And one of my neighbors here is Sandra Ingerman. You're probably familiar with her work, doing very traditional shamanic work. And I remember thinking, okay, Sandra's got a huge group that she's teaching traditional shamanic work to, and she's really kind of keeping them at bay and saying, listen, this is the technique you need to be doing.
Yeah.
And I took the shamanic idea and I said, wait a minute. And then I was looking at, years ago, I met the woman who created EMDR, which to me is a shamanic technique with, they're doing theta. And I decided that with the Beyond Shamanism, I was going to teach people the shamanic technique, help them learn how to go into this state, explore it from a bunch of different ways, but then be looking, where could this go?
Yeah.
EMDR is using a shamanic technique for trauma. Sure. You're accessing a world inside that can be used for all kinds of really cool things. So we touch on that a little bit. We touch on the psychedelics because there's this huge world of healing addiction and trauma using psychedelics, which to me is really risky. Because if anybody knows anything about shamanic techniques, we talk about this, and anybody who's done psychedelic research talks about set and setting. And this is really important. You've got to have the right mindset, and you got to create the proper setting in order to have a decent experience. You know, you've probably seen people do shamanic journeys and have a really bad trip, right? Psychedelics are worse because you can't pull yourself out of it.
Yeah,
this is,
often there's no integration work behind it either.
Exactly. And it's in my mind, it's too much too soon.
Mm.
And if you can, this is where the power of the shamanic drumming technique can come in, because it is a learned response and you develop a skill set. And that means you're learning how to integrate what you're experiencing. And when you do a trip and you hit your trauma, which is what happens and what these guys are trying to help people through, right? You can do real damage to people. You can really do damage to somebody's psyche because there's not enough. You've got the wrong setting. That person wasn't in the right psychological state, so their state was wrong. And now you've got a person that's in worse shape than they were before they did their trip. With shamanic techniques, because it's a slower build, because it's a learning process, the risk of that happening is lower, and you can also be teaching people how to properly integrate. And I think that's the future of the shamanic technique, is to really dig deep into trauma. And that's a world that, and addiction as well.
Yeah.
I think those two I think that's the future of shamanic work in my mind. And then, it could easily take over almost every form of talk therapy, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah.
I mean, if you gain a little self-awareness and you kind of know your stuff, and you get to learn a little bit about how your own mind works and the traps that your mind can take you, that has in there, you don't need to be talking to a psychotherapist every week. Just do some journeys, do some journaling, explore your stuff,
There's a quote you just reminded me that, you know, I'm writing a book about using drumming as a tool for women's empowerment, and there's a quote I've put in the book that talks about in Rwanda, they sent Western talking therapists to help people with their trauma. And there's a quote I found in a newspaper where this guy said, there was no singing, no drumming, and no dancing, and no way to put the joy back into your heart. Instead, they took us into a dingy little room and made us talk about bad things that had happened to us. We had to ask them to leave.
It's true. And if you're moving and if you're listening and you're going into that altered state by drumming and dancing and singing, you get to process it.
Exactly.
If you're talking about it, all you're doing is bringing it up, stirring it around and putting it back. And sometimes you're putting it back worse than it started. Because every time we access a memory, it changes. Doesn't mean it's going to change for the better.
Yeah.
And so trauma could be actually exacerbated by doing that kind of work.
Yeah.
But you know, now the psychologist is going to be mad at me. But you know, you got to process it somehow, and talking isn't processing.
Yeah. I'd love to talk to you all day, Jeff, but we're running towards the end of our time. So to conclude this, I'd just like to make sure that people know where to find you and what's, because you maybe very briefly explain the services you have available. I know about your Brain Stim audio program, for instance, but first of all, where can people find you easily?
Well, I have two places, three places that are pretty easy. Strong Institute is our main website. That's where we have all of our research, well, most of our research, where we present where we have our CDs, my courses are there. And then I have the place that really has my music, including our custom program, is brainstimaudio.com. That's Brain Stim as in stimulation, audio. And that has music that's across 7 categories. It goes everywhere from the meditation, like the deep shamanic stuff, to focus and brain boost, which is enhancing memory and cognitive function, and sleep, and all those things. And so that's the music. That's what I spend my time doing. I also have a YouTube channel where I have a lot of videos where I talk about this, a lot of the analytical end of things, the techniques I use, a lot of the rhythms I use. That's where I put some of the EEG research. There's a lot more that needs to go up, but I have so much that I haven't had a chance to, and there's a lot that I don't even have videos for yet. So those are the main things. So if you go to YouTube, just type in Jeff Strong. You should find my channel there. But otherwise, Strong Institute has everything. Brain Stim Audio has the music.
All right. Thank you very much, Jeff. I'm very grateful you took the time to talk to us today.
Oh, it was my pleasure. It's always fun to talk about things. I know I can go on. So
yeah. Thank you.
Okay.
Bye.
Well, take care.